I want to thank all the clergy at B'nai Jeshurun for helping me through the pandemic and for enabling all of this Zooming, which keeps us healthy and safe in our homes. And I really want to thank Dave, who's really helped me to get set up for today. And of course, Rabbi Felicia for the invite. Without further ado, I actually on my screen can't see you all at once, which means that if you raise a hand, it'll be hard for me to know whether you want to participate or say anything. So it's probably best to put it into the chat, and I'll try, as I can, and Dave will help me to call on people throughout this presentation. I'll leave some time at the end for questions, and so as well as an email where if you want to get in touch with me afterward with other questions and disagree with me, I'm happy for that. I think that this, basically I was presented by Rabbi Felicia with the task to teach this particular Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. It's not one that I've written on or have really thought very deeply about until having to prepare this presentation. So you're getting sort of my first presentation on it in a way. It's not that I'm not thinking about dispute in the name of heaven, which we'll get to in a minute when I get to the Mishnah from Pirkei Avot. I think though this presentation is motivated by, if you're a teacher in the classroom at the moment, in the present moment, I think our challenges are, how do we teach our students how to converse with each other in civil ways? How do we get them to understand each other? How do we get them to be patient with one another? Even though I'm at JTS, where I have the fortune of students from a whole wide range of backgrounds, and I'm fortunate to teach in all of the schools at JTS. I think that, in all my years of teaching, I've been at JTS 22 years, I feel like it's becomes harder and harder rather than easier and easier. And it's conversations like I think we'll have today that maybe will just be a bit of an inspiration for all of us to think about what it means to be in dispute with others, how we engage in conversation when we don't agree with that person across the room. How do those conversations in any way, shape, or form ever lead to anything that can change matters or maintain status quo if that's what we want? So I'm really speaking, I think, today from a bit of experience in the classroom and hoping that this conversation will enable me to rethink some of the ways in which I get my students to argue with one another and converse with one another. So where I want to begin, here is my first slide. I just want to begin with a bit, and I know some of you who've been studying Pirkei Avot for the last few weeks already know this, but I want to just make sure that we're all on the same page, that Pirkei Avot is Mishnah. The Mishnah is a Tannaitic collection. It was pieced together sometime between 200 BCE and 200 CE. It represents the thoughts of the rabbis who lived during that time period, and it marks really what is the core of what then becomes the Talmud. We will have a Babylonian Talmud as well as a Jerusalem Talmud, or what we call the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. So we have two Talmuds that then comment on the Mishnah. As you will see today in this presentation, I bring material both from the Babylonian and the Palestinian or Jerusalem Talmuds. And so you will see that as I move through. Interestingly, Pirkei Avot has no Gemara, meaning it doesn't have a tractate of Gemara associated with it, but it does have sort of a commentary or another collection called Pirkei de Rabbi Natan. Avot de Rabbi Natan. And Avot de Rabbi Natan is sort of like a Gemara on Pirkei Avot. but the traditional tractate or the traditional volumes of the Talmud do not comment directly on Pirkei Avot, which means that I'm going to draw material from other places in the Talmud in order to reflect on this Mishnah that I was tasked to teach. So the Mishnah appears in the Mishnah that I was tasked to teach. Oh, sorry, before I get to that, sorry, I am off kilter here. Hold on. Hold on a second. Okay. Okay. So the Mishnah that I was tasked to teach is Pirkei Avot 5:17. And so I'm going to start just by reading it to you. I'm going to read it first in Hebrew and then in English, although I'll deal mostly in English just because I think there's a little bit of difficulty in some of the translations. But Kol machloket shehi l'shem shamayim sofa lehitkayem v'she'eina l'shem shamayim ein sofa lehitkayem. So a translation of it is every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure, but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. And we're going to talk about this word lehitkayem in a minute, but right now I'm translating it as endure. So the disputes that happen for the sake of heaven are those that endure, and the ones that don't, that are not for the sake of heaven, do not endure. So my question for all of you to start out, and I hope that I can engage you in some discussion. My problem right now, and I'm really sorry, is that my the bar on the bottom of my computer covers the arrows for the screen change. So you just have to bear with me in terms of the screen change. But anyway, okay. So can any of you just describe what you think a dispute in the name of heaven is versus a dispute that's not in the name of heaven? And what does it mean that it endures versus it doesn't endure? So if I could just throw that out there, just to start off, what is a dispute that occurs in the name of heaven? Can somebody describe what that is even?
Something that will cause no suffering, will be for the betterment. People will flourish because of it versus people causing other people suffering.
Okay, so one thought is that it's going to actually cause community to flourish, or the people who are engaged in that dispute to flourish. Okay, terrific. Anything else? I don't see. Okay, so I'm going to keep going then. So that's one good point. Now, what I'm going to do is now I'm going to show you the rest of the Mishnah from Pirkei Avot, in which it defines for you what they think is a dispute that is in the name of heaven versus one that is not. Okay, so I'm going to reread the beginning of the Mishnah and then its response to and its definition of what these disputes are. So every dispute, and now you could see in the bottom box, every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure. So every dispute that is for the sake of heaven, we're now translating as endure, but the word lehitkayem, some translate it as the argument will lead to an established result, meaning the argument that ensues will actually be mitkayem, will endure. Why? Because there is an actual answer or result that comes out of the dispute. And so that's one way of reading this. I don't know whether it's the only way, but it's just, there are several translations that if you look up this Mishnah, you will find. And the one that appears in some Talmudim, like Sefaria has it online, is not the same as others. In other words, there are various ways to translate this Mishnah. but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. And then the translation of that can also be, will not lead to any established result. So it just sort of remains as a dispute, but there is no resolution to it. Which is the controversy that is for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Hillel and Shammai. And which is the controversy that is not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and all of his congregation. So basically now what we're going to compare and contrast is we're going to compare and contrast the kind of dispute that was proposed by Korach in Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers 16. And we're going to put that opposite, the kind of dispute that is or was or occurred between Hillel and Shammai, the famous Tannaitic sages, who so famous were they that they in fact became houses, meaning they became the leaders of groups of individuals. And so therefore, very often in the Mishnah, they're referred to as Beit Hillel or Beit Shammai, meaning a group of sages represented by Hillel and versus those represented by Shammai. Okay, so we're going to start with Korach. Okay, that one may seem the easier of the two. Can somebody tell me anything they know about Korach before I kind of like venture into the verses on Korach? What do you know about Korach, and why might the Mishnah have used Korach as the example of the dispute that is not for the sake of heaven? Bringing back that whole idea of disputes that create flourishing communities or ones that don't generate suffering, as an example. Does anyone want to give us a sense about Korach? Anyone know a little bit about him?
He said, why aren't we all priests? Aren't we a nation of priests?
Okay, well, a little bit more than why aren't we priests? It's more like, why didn't... Yeah. Okay, so yes, we'll leave it at that.
Rhetorically.
Yes.
Aren't we priests? Why aren't we all priests?
Okay.
He also challenged Moshe, to say, you think you're better than I am, you're not.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so he basically is this one who raises an objection to Moshe, which we're going to read in the verses in a second. He's also known clearly as the one who not only poses a challenge to Moshe, but also he's the rabble rouser, meaning he's the one who kind of like gets a lot of the people, the Israelites, to follow in his footsteps and oppose Moshe along with him. He is not considered traditionally, I think, all that well. Does anyone know why he's viewed not to be... He doesn't have a very positive rap, so to speak. Does anyone know why? Can anyone tell me why? Just
the earth opens up and swallows him.
Okay, so we basically know the end of the story. The end of the story is that the earth opens up and he is swallowed. Well, I shouldn't say he. The earth opens up and 15,000 Israelites are swallowed up. Okay, just by comparison, after the golden calf incident, 3,000 are killed. So 15,000 is a huge amount. So given the gravity of the punishment by God, the presumption is, if we work backward, that of course Korach did something that was very upsetting to God, and therefore not something that we should follow in the footsteps of, which is why Pirkei Avot obviously picks up on the idea that his dispute was not in the name of heaven. Okay, so I'm just going to read a little bit from number 16. I've skipped around a little bit just to give us some clarity about Korach, because we're going to look at the rabbinic material, what we call sort of a midrash or a commentary on Korach, because what I want to present to you is that Pirkei Avot is one view of Korach, but that's not the only view of Korach. The Hasidic Rebbe, the rabbi of Kotzker, and I know this is 19th century, he loved Korach. He called Korach the holy grandfather. And so he's picking up, of course, from some older midrashic rabbinic material that saw Korach in somewhat of a positive light. So I'm bringing up that material to kind of challenge the way in which Pirkei Avot presents these disputes. And then we'll kind of, move to Hillel and Shamai. So here's the story of Korach from number 16. Now Korach, who was the son of Yitzchar, the son of Kohat, the son of Levi. So Korach is a Levite. He took himself along with Datan and Aviran, sons of Eliab, and Om, son of Pelet, who were descendants of Reuven. So if you remember, Reuven is the oldest son of Yaakov. So it makes sense, I guess, that Reuven might have had some rights to being leader of all of the people, because Reuven was firstborn. So he gathers some Levites together with Reubenites, and he rises up against Moshe together with 250 Israelites who were considered chieftains of the community, chosen in the assembly as men of repute. So basically, he's joining with a group of men who were known as Anshe Shem. They were known as men of goodness or greatness in some way. So again, he's representing the Levites. He combines himself with the Reubenites and then with some Israelites, and they rise up against Moses and Aaron and say, "You've gone too far, for all of the community are holy, all of them, and God is in their midst. Why then do you, Moses and Aaron, raise yourself above God's congregation?" So Korach is known as the jealous Levite, the one who was passed over, the one who's saying, wait a minute, what about me? But on the other hand, he does say all the community is holy. And one of the things that may have really bothered Korach was the structure of this community and the way in which leadership went in some type of hierarchical manner being given to Moshe and Aharon to govern. And so may have really been more than just the jealous rabble-rouser. Okay. Then Moses responds and he says to Korach and also the Levites, "Hear me, sons of Levi. Is it not enough for you that God of Israel has set you apart from the community of Israel and given you direct access to perform the duties of the tabernacle and to minister to the community and serve them? Now that God has advanced you and all your fellow Levites with you, do you want the priesthood too?" So there's a difference between the Levites and the kahuna, or the priesthood. And basically Moshe is saying, wait a minute, you already have a special status as Levites. Now you want to be Kohanites, meaning now you want more than that? Truly, it is against God that you and all your company have banded together, for who is Aaron that you should rail against him? Why are you upset with Aaron and with me? And Moses also sent for Datan and Aviram, and they said to him, we are not going to come before you. And basically Moshe realized that, in fact, what's happening here is that he could not calm down the masses. He could not calm down the crowd. And that's when the response that comes to Moshe is it not enough that you brought us from a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness, that you would lord it over us? We will not come to you, Moshe. We will not come before you. Okay. Now, what happens as this material is received by the rabbis? What happens to it? So there's comment here. And what happens in rabbinic literature is there seems to be some desire to absolve Korach, to state that it wasn't Korach's fault, or that Korach, for some reason, wasn't part of all the people who were punished. So here is just a quote from the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin. They tell us that Rabbi Yochanan tells us that Korach was not among the swallowed. He was not among the swallowed, as it is written. And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their houses and all the men who were with Korach. And from that they infer, but not Korach himself. And so I just want you to kind of think about that. Why is it that Korach is now somehow absolved? He doesn't get punished. I thought that we were so clear on the fact that he did something wrong, therefore there was punishment. But there's for some reason, rabbinic literature wants to stay one step removed from critiquing Korach. I'm going to try to, okay. Now, you just have to sort of stay with me for a few minutes. I'm going to share with you this one passage that also appears in Sanhedrin. So there's a very large passage in Sanhedrin that is all about Korach and all about these verses. It's midrashic in nature, which means that it basically retells the story of Korach by quoting the verses in Numbers and retells the story. It begins with Korach's wife. And I'm going to ask you, before I even venture into reading this, why is it that Korach's wife is the one that the rabbis are going to place all of the criticism upon? And so why is it that it's the wife who's not even mentioned along with Korach that somehow is the one in which gets all the critique? Okay, so why are they moving us in the direction of a conversation between Korach's wife and Korach? Why add Korach's wife into this story? Why add her to the narrative? Anyone have a guess, a thought, objection?
Well, I definitely have an objection, and it's easy to blame someone else, and to make Korach not the fault. That someone, just like Adam and Eve, it's Eve's fault that Adam took the apple. So it's easy to blame the wife because he was so influenced.
And generally in rabbinic literature, it's very common that when the rabbis have a critique, for some reason they lodge it through women. I'm not exactly sure why that happens, but it's always like a kind of like this hook, that sort of this moment where when I read those texts, I say, okay, they're about to say something, they're about to use this woman in a way to critique somebody else who really deserves the critique. But anyway, so it's happens a lot in rabbinic literature. But I'm going to jump in. I'm going to read this passage. Korach's wife said to him, "See what Moses is doing. He is the king. He appointed his brother Aaron, the high priest, and he appointed his brother's sons as deputy priests. If truma is the food that was set aside by every individual to give to the priesthood so that they would be fed. So if truma is offered, he says, let it be for the priest. If the people bring the tithe, maaser, which you as Levites take to sustain yourself, he says, give 1/10 to the priest." In summary here, just to say, the Korach's wife is saying to Korach, are you kidding me? Look what Moses is doing. Moses has set up this system that makes it all good for him and these Levites. Great. But really, does that make sense? And furthermore, Moses shears your hair and makes fun of you as if you are as insignificant as excrement, as though he set his sights on your hair and wishes you to be shaven and unsightly. So we know this actually from the Tanakh. The Torah tells us that the one of the commandments that the priests were given was they were supposed to actually shave their bodies of all of its hair, of all their bodily hair. And so that was kind of a requirement. And so they're using this as kind of like the critique. Why would Moses do that? Why would Moses say that? Why would Moses tell you to do that? And then Korach responds and says, but didn't he also do so? Didn't Moses also listen to the commandment of what Levites were supposed to do? And so Moses actually listened to these laws. So Korach is actually defending Moshe. Korach said to her, and then she says to him, since it is all done for his own prominence, he, by the way, is doing this, Moshe, to make himself prominent, meaning he's willing to embarrass himself just in order to give himself the sense of difference, the sense of greatness, the sense of prominence as a Levite. Isn't that the same thing that Samson did? Basically, I know that the story of Samson occurs much, much later, but Samson, they're bringing up Samson here as the one who uses his power to completely, at the end of the story, he uses his power to himself, humiliate himself and die among the Philistines. So yes, he wants the Philistines to die, but he's willing to embarrass himself in front of the nation by killing himself along with them. Similarly, Moses is willing to embarrass himself as well. Okay, and so she basically, I just have to get to the next slide. Okay, and so she basically is saying, don't listen to Moshe. Moshe is not leading you in a good place. And then she says, furthermore, with regard to that which he told you to prepare sky blue dye for your ritual fringes. Right before the story of Korach, the commandment is for tzitzit. The commandment is to put tzitzit on every garment and to dye them or have a blue string running through it. That, or to have it as blue, I should say. Actually, I should just bring the slide up. I'm sorry, I don't want to, hold on. I'm having trouble. Okay, so right before, so here's the commandment. Speak to the Israelite people and instruct them to make fringes on the corners of their garment. Let them attach a cord of blue to the fringe at each corner. So that is right before the story of Korach. And so now the wife of Korach comes in and she says, if it enters your mind, Moses, that using sky blue dye is considered a mitzvah, take out robes that are made entirely of material colored with sky blue dye and dress all the students of your academy in sky blue robes without ritual fringes. Why could one not fulfill the mitzvah in that manner? Basically, and I hope this is making sense, but Korach is trying to say here, the wife of Korach is trying to blame Moshe for coming up with laws and rituals that are not necessarily conveyed clearly in the Torah, and that he is basically fabricating them. But in fact, one could have actually taken the blue and run it through the entire garment. You could have worn blue garments, and that would have been a way in which one could have fulfilled this commandment. And so Korach's wife is blaming Moshe for coming up with all of this foolish, all of these laws himself that are not actually commanded by God, but are interpreting them in his own way. And so the wife of Korach is kind of warning Korach against the power of Moses. And then the end of this piece just quotes from Proverbs and basically calls this wife the foolish one who pulls her house down with her hands, meaning any wife who's as foolish and states such foolish ideas basically destroys the house. And so it's her fault. And so in this regard, we hear from the rabbinic material that they're trying to absolve, I'm sorry, I just have to forward. They're trying to absolve Korach. Okay, so just as a, before I venture into the piece with Hillel and Shamai, I just want to point out that, so Korach, if we have material, even though it's put into the mouth of the wife of Korach, it seems as though the rabbis are not having, they don't necessarily believe that the dispute that Korach lodges is entirely wrong. Meaning, if they're willing to critique Korach through his wife, it means that there's something, or absolve Korach in some way, it means that there's something about the dispute that Korach lodges that is actually reasonable and okay. There is something there. So even though the Pirkei Avot text tells us that this is the kind of dispute that a person raises with another that is not in the name of heaven and that shouldn't endure. In fact, we know very well that there are times when a person has to rise up against a leader because the leader in their minds is not actually doing what they feel is right. Maybe they're not being democratic enough. Maybe they're being too overwhelming. Maybe they're asserting their power in too much of an aggressive way. I'm not saying that the Talmudic material is trying to completely and totally say that Korach was a righteous individual. I'm only saying that they're struggling to some extent with Korach because they know that the content of what he is trying to bring to the surface may not necessarily be what is as problematic as the way in which he goes about bringing the challenge to Moshe. So that's what I'm trying to get after here. When we're talking about a dispute that does not endure because it's not in the name of heaven, we may actually not be talking about the content of that dispute, but rather about the structure of the dispute. And so structurally, Korach may in fact have been mistaken in the structural way in which he rabble-roused and got people to be behind him. But in fact, the content of what he stood for may have been actually okay. Now, to move to Hillel and Shammai for a moment, who I think are more well known to us. I'm sorry, I gotta go back. I skipped one. Okay, so here's the famous Hillel and Shammai piece that I think is really familiar to a lot of you. Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, for 3 years, Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai, and Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, disagreed with one another. These said, the halakhah is in accordance with our opinion. And these said, the halakhah is in accordance with our opinion. And ultimately, a divine voice, you can see it in the Hebrew, a bat kol, came out and stated, both these and those are the words of the living God. However, the halakhah is in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. What's the difference here? What's the difference in the nature of the disputing happening here with Hillel and Shammai as opposed to with Korach? What is the fundamental difference here? Somebody want to?
It wasn't personal.
Okay, it wasn't personal. What else?
I think actually, I can think of a few of their disputes actually.
Correct.
That I was taught. One I think sort of is a personal one. It has to do with a bride and whether you can tell an ugly bride on her wedding day that she's beautiful or not.
That's correct.
And
That's
I think
right.
another one has to do with Birkat Hamazon, where Shammai would say, I think it was Shammai who said that if you forget to say Birkat Hamazon where you ate, you have to go back to the place where you ate to recite Birkat Hamazon.
That's right.
Most people probably wouldn't do. And the last one that I think is more familiar to all of us is the Hanukkah candles.
Correct. That's right. So all of those disputes, in the case of the Hanukkah candles, it's Shammai says that you light 8 and go backward. Hillel says, we follow Hillel, we light 1 for each night and move forward. The case of the bride is that she is, Shammai says, if the bride is ugly, you can't say to her, she's beautiful. And Hillel says, no, every bride that you see is beautiful. And so you have to claim that she's beautiful. And the third one was Birkat Hamazon. Shammai would say, you better go back to where you ate and say Birkat Hamazon. And Hillel says, no, just say it wherever you are as soon as you remember. So Hillel, in all those cases, or at least in a lot of cases, is known to be the more lenient, the more humble. And so even though we're not saying that Shammai is wrong per se, we're saying better, we should go with the opinion of Hillel. There are only 18 cases that we follow Shammai. And so, it's basically Hillel that we embrace over Shammai. And that goes back to if the argument leads to some well-established result or conclusion, then it endures, right? In other words, there is some conclusion that we get to. There is some, there's an argument, and then there's a decision that's made, and one piece of the argument is, is the correct way of going about our lives, and the other one is left aside, but the other, meaning the opinion of Shammai, is still preserved because both are supposedly stated in the name of heaven, meaning both are the words of God. And so the thought is that you maintain and you report and you record Shammai's position, because one day you might actually re-argue and go a different way. You might actually argue and rest with Shammai. And so personally, I have the most difficulty. I love the part of the this statement that mentions that all words and everything that we all debate are all the words of God when they're stated humbly and in a kind and good way. I love that about Hillel and Shammai. But what makes me very nervous is this notion that the halakhah goes in accordance with Hillel. That makes me a little bit concerned because, in fact, it could and has led to a degree of rigidity and stasis that sometimes we haven't actually revisited some of the things that we do, and we haven't actually brought up the other opinion, and we haven't necessarily said that maybe in some cases Shammai actually had a good point, and maybe in fact we should bring back Shammai, or maybe we could even live with Hillel and Shammai. I don't think it matters all that much if I like candles 1 to 8 and you like candles 8 to 1. I think we could still be part of the same community. I think we could still live together. But unfortunately, what happens is if you walk into somebody's home and they're lighting candles the wrong way, you say, wait a minute, no, I'm not, that's just not the right way. And so to me, I find that sometimes this debate, this Hillel and Shammai, which ends up with we follow Hillel, can be sometimes problematic. I also want to just point out, and just in the interest of time, I don't think I'm going to get through all my slides here, but I just want to say in the interest of time that it also happens that debate, Hillel versus Shammai, sometimes, I shouldn't even say sometimes, basically Hillel and Shammai develop into their own, or they create their own hierarchy, meaning the rabbis create their own type of hierarchy in which their knowledge of Torah is considered supreme over those who don't learn Torah. And so you can see here in this next slide where Yossi ben Yoezer used to say, this is also in Pirkei Avot, let your house be a house of meeting for sages and sit in the very dust of their feet and drink in their words with thirst. Meaning, what should you do? You should actually have sages always be welcomed into your home so that they can teach you Torah, so that you can drink in their words, so that you can with thirst learn Torah. But isn't it true that it should be dialogic? Meaning it shouldn't be that just the sage teaches and I, being the average Joe in my house, drink it in. It should actually be much more dialogic And we should be, in fact, learning from one another. And what bothers me about the Hillel and Shammai piece is that very often that debate is occurring within rabbinic context among sages who are all knowledgeable of Torah, rather than between one rabbi and somebody who's not rabbi. It turns out that some are really left out of that debate. Many voices were left out of the Hillel and Shammai type of debate, including this woman here, who was the mother of Rabbi Yishmael, and I'll read it quickly. The mother of Rabbi Yishmael came and spoke and was welcomed by the rabbis. She said, "My son Yishmael deserves rebuke because he does not treat me with honor," meaning kibud ava'em. He doesn't honor me as a mother. At that moment, the faces of the rabbis looked grieved, and they said, "Is it possible that Rabbi Yishmael doesn't treat his parents or his mother with honor, with respect?" They said to her, "So what did he do? Or what did he do to you?" And she said, "When he would come back from the house of study on a particular day, I would want to wash his feet and drink from them. And he would not allow me to do this." So basically she's trying to say, picking up on Pirkei Avot, I want to learn his Torah. I don't want to be excluded. I want to drink it up with all the thirst. I want him to come and learn in my household, not necessarily only in the house of study. And I want to be part of that. And for whatever reason, he was not allowing her to do that. Then the rabbis thankfully come back and they say, since that is her desire to wash Rabbi Yishmael's feet and drink the water, that is her honor, meaning he has to do it and he should do it. The only problem I have here, of course, is the fact that the way they express, of course, her thirst has to be done through the dirty water. So it's, again, creating this sort of difficult interchange and telling us that really it's these rabbis who create that hierarchy, and that there were some who really felt excluded from that. And so in some ways, I have a little trouble with Hillel and Shammai being representative of the kind of dispute that is in the name of heaven. Okay, I'm gonna move on from this because I don't have time. Okay, hold on. Okay, so to sum up, here's just a summary of the what I presented, that Hillel and Shammai are the dispute. They represent the dispute among equals. They represent the dispute that, in fact, both sides of the dispute live on and endure. Both opinions are recorded. Hillel generally holds the opinion that's legally accepted. Shammai loses and lives according to the law set by Hillel, but he's still honored. The problem that I raised was that it often can create unfair hierarchies, meaning we haven't gotten around the fact that even through the dispute of Hillel and Shammai, we haven't yet gotten around, or at least the rabbis don't present to us enough of the way to get around the fact that it's the rabbis' voices who are the loudest and not necessarily everyone else's voices. Which brings me to Korach, which is the dispute that is in fact in the name of gaining power, where the earth, of course, swallows them all up because Korach is considered the one who does not approach dispute in the ways in which God would like. But the problem there, I see it, is that some leadership structures do really need to be challenged. And if the hierarchy is problematic, then there needs to be a way in which we can voice our dissatisfaction. And so how does one go about doing that? Now, so just to, again, I'm sort of like bringing this to conclusion. What does it mean to engage in a dispute in the name of heaven? I think when Pirkei Avot is talking about it, Pirkei Avot is more interested not in what we're disputing, but in how we engage in the dispute. How do we approach this conversation? The fact that we need to listen to everyone's voices. The fact that we can't just discredit those who may or we think may not know as much as we might know. The fact that we can't do as Korach did. Korach's mistake was that Korach didn't discuss at length with the people around him what he thought was wrong with Moshe, and then bring it to Moshe as a group for discussion. And then Moshe doesn't respond either with a sense of open-mindedness to think about what Korach and the people might have been fearing about his leadership. There was no interchange, there was no dialogue, there was no learning from one another. And that was the how was all messed up. The ways in which dispute occurred was problematic. So I bring now to the conclusion of this, and then I'll open it up for you to ask me some questions. My own sense is that Moses and Korach reflect the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. So they each have opinions, but they're not uncomfortable in any way with the ways in which they are engaging with the situation in the desert. And they don't question or confront the challenges that are posed to them. They're just like, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm right, you're wrong. And they fail to look within. Even Moshe is not looking within. And when they fail to look within, they're fearing that they're going to lose something. Moshe doesn't want to lose. Moshe doesn't want his leadership to be challenged by Korach, and so he doesn't engage in the kind of conversation that might have enabled Korach to even understand Moshe's leadership power, or might have resulted in Moshe giving in and sort of conducting his leadership in a more democratic way. So they failed to listen to each other. And because what they hear is different from what they're thinking in the moment. They're all about complaint, but not about reasonable solution. It's so easy to say, I'm against this. Absolutely simple. I know what I'm against. But can you actually state clearly what you're for and why? And so that is always, the solution, the what I'm for, the constructive and generative nature of debate is what we're after. So they didn't have an honest exchange, and that's not sustainable. When we don't have honest exchanges, it's not sustainable. I was once sitting at a table, it was my father's birthday, and my uncle was there. My kids were there. And a friend of my mother's happened to be there as well, an ardent Trump supporter. And my uncle mentioned something that was against Trump, and it had to do with Israel. And she just laid it out. And she said, no, how can you think that way? That's not acceptable. You are completely wrong. And in front of my children, and my children learned so much from this, he said, no. I will, he said, if I state my opinion, will you listen to me? And she said, no, because you'll be wrong. And he said, okay, debate over. We cannot have a conversation. And in that ended it. And that's where I think that we need so much to be open and listen to other. And very often we don't do that. With Hillel and Shamai, I feel like they're the ones for whom, yes, that's debate in the name of heaven. They appear to listen to one another, see the value of preserving all opinions, despite having to live according to one opinion at a time. And although their model is still fraught because of the voices that aren't included, because their model threatens us with rigidity and stasis, it's still a model that the Mishnah chooses and still is, to this day, what we consider the better model. The better how. And then finally, I can make my last slide come. Okay. Just one more thing, sorry. So what's the takeaway? What's in it for all of us? I just have to say that I think behind every dispute in which we engage there needs to be an ongoing desire to transform the status quo, as well as a desire to somewhat preserve it as well. I think there's always this sense that we have to change everything. Yes, we want to change things, but on some level, we also want to protect, we want to keep. When Hillel and Shammai are debating, Hillel may win out, but we're still preserving Shammai's opinion. And so there's an attempt that I think always needs to be made when we're speaking, when we're debating in the name of heaven, to recognize that we're trying to change something, but we don't want to let go of absolutely everything. Similarly, how we dispute has to be grounded in the courage to acknowledge all we do not know. It has to be grounded in an ability to admit that we were wrong. There was nothing that Moshe was admitting to there. There was nothing that Moshe was saying there that maybe I am doing something that's not appealing to the people out there. And we also have to be willing to change our own minds. We have to really tread carefully if we are going to have productive dispute. I think that one of the images that I get of the swallowing of 15,000, which I'm very upset that God did, but I think that it's symbolic of just how dangerous dispute can be and how it can do so much damage rather than be generative and constructive. And so with that, I will leave my presentation for a few minutes of question, if those of you want to argue with me or raise any questions to what I had to say. So go for it. Okay.
It might be easier if we take the slides down so we can
Oh
see.
yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, hold on. Stop my share. Here we go. Ah, okay. I see there's a lot in the chat here. Okay, and so I see from, I'm just gonna share some of the comments in the chat and comment on them. So Lori said that, hi Lori, that Hillel may have been more correct in his opinion, but both have good motivation. And I think that's also a dispute in the name of heaven always will be motivated by something good. And the key is, of course, to find what is the motivation in that other person that is for good. And like the old joke from Nancy Kaplan, you're both right, but we have to choose which one to go with. In other words, I've always been, I've been brought up to believe that you've got to make a decision in the end of the day, because an institution can't run without a specific type of decision. So if we're all using different sidurim in, BJ on a Saturday morning, that could be really complicated. On the other hand, I really believe that it might actually work. And I've seen this with the laning at BJ, like Purim, people use different laning trope in order to lane the Purim Megillah. So I wonder, like, sometimes we need to make a decision, but sometimes we can live with both. And so I really, I'm very much of the ilk that, is it possible to create communities in which we can live with doing people who do different things, but can still sit next to each other? Sandy, I see your hand up. Did you want to?
Yeah, I have a question. So I'm thinking back to the story about Aknai's oven and how this works, because when I think of that story, there was an awful dispute and among the rabbis, and the outcome was terrible. And the rabbis, who, by the way, are the ones telling the story and drawing their conclusion, which seems to me, I'm just saying, It seems rather self-serving. And I've just been troubled by that story all this time, which that's not the case with this story that we're talking about tonight. And so in a way you could say, was Agnai's oven a dispute for the sake of heaven, when in fact, when heaven spoke, they didn't care? So I don't know, what can you, I don't know if I'm off the track, you're bringing this up, but.
So you're not in any way off the track. I really am, I like the fact that you raise this oven of Achnai. And one of the things that I didn't get to in the presentation was the role of God here. I mean, I mentioned it a few times, but I think that, there's a different role that God plays in the Hillel and Shammai piece from the ways in which God plays a role in the Korach piece. And I think that there is something similar in the Hillel and Shammai piece, where God is saying, it's Hillel's opinion we follow, not mine, God's, but it's man's opinion that we follow. In other words, you as a community, what's heavenly is the way in which we debate, not what we debate and not what we decide. So that's what I think is going on. And so God is, in that Achnai story, is basically leaving it to us, rather than, the miraculous, powerful God. And in fact, that's the danger. That's the real sadness of the Korach story, is when God got involved, it became a mess. If God had allowed, or if God had taught Korach and Moshe to debate properly, he might not have needed to intervene that way. So anyway, but thank you for bringing that up. That was a good comparison. I see a hand, Lori. Did you want to add something?
No, I wanted to make a request. I would like a copy of that last slide.
Oh, sure. I'll send you the whole thing. I'll share it with Dave, and he can share all the slides with you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I meant to, I guess it should have been shared in advance, but absolutely. I'm just going to quickly look at the chat here. There's so many nice comments here. Right. So somebody mentioned that the midrash that I am adding to this, and this was actually Nancy Kaplan. Basically, my husband had the same critique before I gave this shiur, I spoke to him, and he was actually saying the same thing to me, which is, that I'm adding in that I think Moshe and Korach should have had some sort of debate. That's the modern midrashic Marjorie Lehman adding that in. And had that happened, then we would have had a dispute in the name of heaven. And so that was the problem, that they actually didn't sit down together, and that all Korach did was, sort of spread all this bad ill will and ill feeling, rather than be generative and constructive. And apparently, that's a lot of what's happening today as well. We are not thinking through what it is that we're even saying anymore. And very often it comes, like a Korach, like we just want to, critique without really deeply thinking about the reasons and the how we're going to express what it is we want to express. So thank you for that comment. And what happened to Korach's wife? I mean, that's another thing. In other words, Korach's wife, so maybe she is more psychologically minded. Maybe she knew more than he did. Maybe she felt more than he did. I don't know. But I find it fascinating that in this material, she comes in and it's all her fault. She's the one who, sort of takes down the house. I have a lot of issues with that also.
But isn't that one of their debates too, that Shammai doesn't think that everybody should be able to be taught Torah? Isn't that one of their?
Okay, so I skipped that slide. So there's one slide I should have, whatever, but I was rushing. And so in that slide, which I'll send you the entire PowerPoint presentation, you can go back to it. But in that slide, Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is this 7th to 9th century, sort of commentary on Pirkei Avot. But basically, there's a debate between Shamai and Hillel, and Shamai says we should only teach the ones who are smart and rich and come from great pedigree, but Hillel says, no, we should teach everyone. And so that debate is actually, there, which is basically saying to you, just like I'm arguing, that the hierarchy kind of didn't go away, because already by the 7th century, you have people who are believing that Shammai's right and that you should only have certain people who learn Torah. And then Hillel on the other side says, no, everyone should really learn Torah. So, I mean, there's that debate is still extant by the 7th to 9th century. So, sort of interesting. Anyone else? I actually have to turn over now to Dave. And again, thank you to you all for listening. Again, I'll attach the PowerPoint to Dave, who can pass it all on to you in case you want to study it anymore. And please feel free to email me any questions. Always happy to talk about Pirkei Avot. Good night.
Thank you so much. What a rich teaching tonight. And just to say again to everyone who's gathered, as I said at the beginning, this is part of our broader project, Sinai Bound, a journey towards creating a community covenant at BJ. So I want to invite everyone, if you've got thoughts that are still percolating in your mind, in your heart, to visit our virtual community journal. You can go on our website. The link is in the chat. And actually, I want to encourage everyone to click on that link so you've got it open in your browser, whether you want to go there tonight or another time. There are specific prompts about this theme, thinking about how we hold all of this, given the diversity in our community, in the broader Jewish community, and we want to hear your voice and your experience as we build this covenant together. So you can go in there and share any thoughts with video, with audio, with just text, and again, we do want to hear from you. So as we conclude tonight, just to say it is late enough for us to count the Omer. So if you were joining us from Evening Minyan right before this on Zoom, and you still have your Siddur with you, this is in Siddur Sim Shalom on page 236. We are beginning to count the 39th day of the Omer tonight, and I'm sorry, page 237. 237. הנני מוכן ומזומן לקיים מצוות עשה של ספירת העומר. כמו שכתוב בתורה, וספרתם לכם ממחרת השבת, מיום הביאכם את עומר התנופה 7 שבתות תמימות תהיינה, עד ממחרת השבת השביעית תספרו 50 יום. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו על ספירת העומר. היום 39 יום. שהם 5 שבועות ו4 ימים לעומר. Thank you again, Dr. Marjorie Lehman. Thank you to everyone who's with us tonight. Wishing you an Erev Tov. Have a good evening.